Bethkarka called it a mercy when they took the first volunteers. Dr. Saren Okafor remembered the broadcast. She'd been 22, sitting in the university's communal lab in Lagos, watching a holographic relay feed beside 8 other biology students who'd all gone very quiet when narration came through. The Bethkara, long, pale, their anatomy somewhere between serpent and surgeon, their faces smooth and unreadable as polished stone, had explained through their translation drones that the human brain was fundamentally broken. The limbic architecture shared across Homo sapiens represented a design flaw so catastrophically embedded that it had produced, in their clinical estimation, 12,000 years of compulsive self-destruction, war, slavery, environmental collapse. They had the archaeological evidence. They were happy to share it. They proposed was elegant, they said, simple, a targeted modification to the amygdalae and the structures surrounding the anterior cingulate cortex, remove the capacity for certain classes of reactive aggression, trim what they called the archaic surge, the primitive flood of neurochemical violence that had, in their assessment, done nothing for human survival since the Pleistocene. They would do it gently, it wouldn't hurt. Volunteers would experience a brief period of adjustment, then clarity, calm. They would still be human. They would simply be better. 41,000 people signed up in the first 72 hours. Saren had watched the news feeds for weeks afterward. The volunteers looked fine, better than fine. They spoke in measured, pleasant sentences. They said the modification had given them something like peace. One woman, a former soldier from Marseille with a history of PTSD, cried on camera because, she said, for the first time in 30 years she had slept through the night. A man from Chongqing said his relationship with his teenage son had improved beyond anything he'd thought possible. Then the modification spread beyond volunteers. The Bethkara said this was also a mercy. That was 11 years ago. Saren worked in a mobile lab now. It wasn't much. A repurposed shipping container, bolted to an articulated transport chassis, buried under thermal scatter plating, and draped in the same dead electromagnetic signature as the rubble fields it crept through. The resistance called it the Petri dish. She called it home. It was cold, tonight. The way October in what used to be northern France was always cold now, wet and penetrating, seeping through the insulated walls. She had a space heater the size of a shoe box running at full capacity, and she still wore her coat. On the bench in front of her was a row of 12 sample vials, and beside them her notes. Actual paper notes in actual pen, because digital storage was how you got found, and beside those, the photograph. The photograph was of Dr. William Chandra, her mentor at the University of Lagos before the modification, before the Bethkara's gray ships had dropped anchor in the upper atmosphere and begun transmitting. Chandra had been a neurobiologist of the first order, obsessive about what he called the architecture of self, the way identity was physically instantiated in the brain's electrochemical landscape, the way personality and memory and moral reasoning were not abstract concepts, but wet, messy, staggeringly complex physical structures that could be studied, mapped, and, in theory, protected. He'd laughed too loud. He'd smelled of instant coffee and antiseptic. He'd once given a 2-hour lecture on the structural similarities between sea slug neural ganglia and early human cognition, while wearing his lab coat inside out, apparently unaware, and no one had told him. Because everyone in the room had been too gripped by what he was actually saying. He had been one of the first people to identify what the Bethkara modification actually did. Not what it claimed to do, what it actually did. The Bethkara's targeted neurostructural adjustment did indeed reduce reactive aggression. It also, with a reliability that Chandra had documented exhaustively in stolen scans, before the Bethkara's enforcers came for him, stripped away a complex of interlocking brain functions that had no clean name in either human or Bethkara vocabulary. The closest Chandra had come, in the last paper he'd sent Saren before he disappeared, was a phrase he'd borrowed from a 19th century novelist: the capacity for magnificent stubbornness, the neural architecture that made humans argue with God when they thought God was wrong. Circuitry, Behind creative defiance, moral fury, the refusal to accept what was in front of you when everything inside you said it was not acceptable. The same circuitry, he noted, that produced art and music and the willingness to run into a burning building for a stranger. The modification didn't remove evil. It removed the entire dimension of human experience that made certain kinds of goodness possible. The Vethkara, it turned out, didn't want humans to be better. They wanted humans to be manageable. Saren looked at the photograph for a moment longer, then turned back to the vials. She had been working on the reversal for 6 years. Chandra had given her the theoretical framework. She'd spent every day since trying to turn theory into chemistry. And she was close. She knew she was close. The last 2 formulations had shown reversal activity in cortical organoid cultures that made her hands shake when she read the results. Tonight's batch part was refined from those failures, corrected for 3 identified binding errors, synthesized from components she'd traded 2 months of resistance network favors to acquire. There was one problem. She had no way to test it on a living system. The Resistance's medical team had, with complete reasonableness, told her she could not experiment on their people. They were running at reduced capacity already. Losing anyone to a failed neurochemical trial would be operationally devastating. They were right. She knew they were right. She looked at the photograph again. She thought about Chandra saying, in that particular voice he used when he was about to do something inadvisable. The problem with waiting for perfect conditions is that they never arrive, Saren. At some point you have to get in the water. She uncapped the first vial. She held it up in the light, from the single LED strip above the bench, watching the pale solution move. It was beautiful in the way things that might kill you sometimes are. Clear, almost silvery, with a faint luminescence she suspected was an artifact of the bioluminescent bacterial membrane she'd used as a carrier vehicle. It glowed like something that had been asked a question and was still thinking about the answer. She put it down. She picked it up again. She injected it into her own arm. The next hour was not pleasant. She'd expected some discomfort. The cortical organoid tests had shown significant activation cascades in what she thought were the target structures. And activation meant heat. And heat in the brain meant headache. What she had not expected was the quality of it. Not pain exactly, more like pressure, like that had been compressed for a very long time and was now slowly beginning to expand. She sat on the floor with her back against the bench and her knees drawn up and breathed through it with the methodical focus she'd learned doing freediving as a teenager off the coast of Lagos, counting inhalations, counting exhalations, keeping her heart rate as steady as she could manage. 43 minutes. Something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No flash of light, no sense of cosmic revelation. It felt more like a room she'd been navigating in the dark. Suddenly had its lights turned on, and she could see that she'd been bumping into the furniture for years and hadn't known it. Pressure receded. Her vision, which had narrowed slightly during the peak, opened back out to normal. She sat on the floor and breathed and listened to the heater run. Then she began to cry. She hadn't cried in 6 years. After the modification, she'd been taken along with a sweep of resistance-adjacent academics in the 3rd year of the occupation, held for 4 days, and subjected to what the Vethkara's drones described as corrective neurological recalibration. She'd noticed the absence of crying the way you notice the absence of a sound you've lived with. So long you've stopped hearing it. Only when it stopped did she understand how constant it had been. She'd thought she was simply coping, being strong, getting on with it. She'd told herself this story for years, while noticing, in a distant, academic way, that she felt less frightened, less angry, less certain of anything she used to be certain of, less herself. Now she sat on the floor of the Petri dish, and wept not with grief, though grief was part of it, but with something that was not quite any word she had for it. Relief possibly. Rage, definitely. And under the rage, something she hadn't felt since she was 22, watching the holographic feed go quiet in the university lab. The specific and violent emotion of "I will not accept this." She let it run for a while. Then she wiped her face on her coat sleeve. Then she stood up, braced herself against the bench until the dizziness passed, and reached for her notes. There was work to do. She presented her data to the Resistance Council 3 days later. It didn't go well. Council met in a collapsed hotel basement 20 kilometers east of what used to be Reims. They were 7 people around a table made of salvaged door panels, and they had the look of people who had been making hard decisions for too long. Not broken, but compressed, like stone under enormous weight. Commander Adeza Uche, the closest thing the Resistance had to a military head, listened to Saren's report with the flat patience of someone who had learned to absorb bad news without flinching. Dr. Tyus Krentz, the medical officer, interrupted twice to ask technical questions that were actually challenges, which Saren expected and answered with more data than was strictly necessary because she knew what Krentz was going to say before he said it. He said it anyway. "You ran a single-subject trial on yourself," he said.
"You cannot possibly know if—"
"I know my own brain," Saren said. "I know what the modification took from me. I know what came back. Subjective self-report from the trial subject is all we have right now? Yes. Which is why I'm asking for permission to expand the trial. Carefully, voluntarily, subjects to start. If the formula causes destabilization, we lose 3 people and I go back to the lab." Saren looked at the 7 faces. "If I'm right, we get something the Vethkara have spent 11 years trying to take from us. The capacity to choose to fight." Commander Uche set down the tablet she'd been reviewing. "The modified soldiers," she said. Saren nodded. This was why she'd come to the council, to replicate her own reversal in academics or civilians. For the Resistance had, over the past 11 years, lost dozens of fighters to capture and subsequent modification. They came back to Resistance-held territory through various channels, released as a demonstration that the modification was gentle, that it didn't harm, that the modified people were still themselves. And they were, in most ways. But they wouldn't fight. They could be told to. They could understand, intellectually, why fighting was necessary. They simply couldn't make themselves do it. The capacity to override threat response with something like righteous fury, the specific neurological wiring that let a human being choose danger for a reason, it was gone. They were gentle people in a war zone, and some of them cried about it. And some of them didn't, and all of them knew what they'd lost. "Sergeant Miraluka," Uche said. "Corporal Devanand. Private Rojayar, they've all volunteered. More than once." She looked at Krentz. Krentz was quiet for a long moment. Then, "If there's any sign of cortical cascade in the first subject, we stop immediately, and you monitor continuously. Not intermittently, continuously. I'll sleep in the lab." Krentz looked like a man who wanted to say many more objections and had decided reluctantly that he had run out of valid ones. "Fine," he said. Saren spent the next 3 days calibrating the formula. She had a limited synthesis window before the bacterial carrier vehicle degraded, and she used every hour of it. The second batch was cleaner than the first. The third cleaner still. She ran it against every test she could manage in a mobile lab. Organoid activation assays, simulated protein binding models, a toxicity screen she'd rigged from salvaged components, and each time the results said the same thing. It worked, and it did what she said it did, and it didn't appear to do anything else. She slept 4 hours a night. She thought about Chandra constantly. Not with grief exactly, or rather, with grief sharpened into something more useful. She thought about the way he'd moved through the lab, deliberate and unhurried, picking up instruments and setting them down with a precision that had seemed unrushed even when they were racing a deadline. She thought about the specific quality of his attention when something wasn't working. Not frustration, but intensification, as if the problem had simply clarified what he needed to think harder about. She tried to bring that quality to the bench. Some nights it worked. Some nights she just drank cold coffee and rechecked calculations she'd already checked 3 times. On the 4th morning, she told Commander Uche she was ready. With the build of someone who had been very strong and was still strong, but had lost a layer of something beneath the muscle. She had been captured 18 months ago during a supply run that went wrong, held for 6 days, and released. When she came back, she had been, as far as anyone could see, herself. Her memories intact, her personality intact, her relationships with the people she'd served with intact. She sat out the next 3 engagements, saying she couldn't. Not that she was afraid, that she couldn't. There was something she needed to do, the thing she'd always done. And it wasn't there anymore. And she didn't know how to explain it except to say, "It's like trying to run when someone's holding your ankle. I know how to run, I just can't." She sat across from Saren in the lab's single chair and watched the vial in Saren's hand with an expression that was hard to read. Cautious, controlled, with something underneath it that might have been hope, or might have been the memory of hope, which was not the same thing. "I need you to tell me," Saren said. "If you feel anything during or after that seems wrong. Pain, visual disturbance, confusion." "I'll tell you," Luca said. "First hour may be uncomfortable. Worse than what I've got now." Saren considered this honestly. "Probably not," she said, "but different." Luca nodded. "Do it." Saren did it. She settled in, need to watch and wait and run the monitoring equipment, and not think too hard about what she was hoping for. Luca sat in the chair and breathed. The minutes moved. Saren logged observations at 5-minute intervals. 20 minutes, Luca's biometrics showed elevated cortical activity in exactly the regions Saren expected. Every 5 minutes, Luca closed her eyes and sat very still. At 49 minutes, she opened them. She didn't cry. Jaw tightened, and her hands, which had been lying flat on her thighs, closed into fists, slowly, and then opened again. She looked at Saren with an expression that Saren recognized, because she'd seen it in the mirror 3 days ago and nowhere since. "There it is," Luca said quietly. Saren exhaled. "Yeah, God." Luca rubbed her face with both hands. I forgot what that felt like." She sat with it for a moment, this woman who had once been a soldier and would now, apparently, be one again. "It's like being angry," she said. "But at something, at a specific thing, not just." She stopped. Forgot that anger could have a direction. "It can," Saren said. Luca looked at her. "Can we do the other 2 today?" Devanand and Roja Yar showed comparable results. Yar had a difficult 40 minutes. The peak activation was sharper for her. She reported visual scintillations and nausea. But it passed and her post-treatment scans were clean. But by nightfall, all 3 of them were sitting in the corridor outside the lab in a way that made Saren think of pressure finally given room to move. There was no celebration. It was too early for that, and all 4 of them knew it. There was something in the air. Close and particular, the quality of people who have recovered something they thought was gone for good, and are still figuring out what to do with having it back. Saren compiled the data and wrote the report, and sent it to Krentz and Uche, and then she sat at the bench alone in the cold, and stared at the photograph of Chandra for a while. "Found it," she told the photograph. Took a while. The photograph did not respond. She hadn't expected it to. She thought Chandra would have said something like, "Don't stop now." And then, probably, something about sea slugs. The Kara response came faster than anyone expected. Sergeant had assumed they would have some time. The formula was unknown, undetected, moving through the Resistance's networks, with the same careful opacity as everything else they'd managed to keep secret. What she hadn't accounted for was how carefully the Vethkara tracked neurological anomalies. Their modification was not simply a one-time intervention, it left a structural signature. A particular pattern in the electrochemical landscape that their monitoring systems read continuously. The same way a shepherd counted sheep, the same way an accountant checked columns. And when 3 of their counted numbers suddenly read differently, they noticed. The alert came at 0340. One of the Resistance's border watchers, a former meteorologist named Hale, saw the Vethkarup ship before it was supposed to be visible and had the presence of mind to send the burst transmission before the ship's suppressor field could kill communications. 4 words, gray ship, grid reference. Saren was awake in seconds, years of sleeping light in a mobile lab. She heard the activity outside. Luca's voice, sharp and organized, other voices responding, and understood immediately. She was already at the bench when Luca came through the door. We need to move, Luca said. How long? Hale's estimate was 18 minutes. Maybe 20. Saren looked at the bench. 12 synthesized doses in vials. A portable synthesizer she couldn't replace. Her notes. The formula itself, which she had committed to memory long ago, but which only mattered if she was alive to transmit it. I need 8 minutes, she said. You have 6. She had 5. She packed the doses first. Padded case. Thermal controlled. The kind of careful handling that you couldn't rush, but that she had learned to do very fast. And then the synthesizer folded down to its minimum configuration, and then she realized she was out of time and grabbed the notes and shoved them inside her coat and ran. Outside, the Resistance's people were in controlled motion, not panic, something different, the focused urgency of people who had practiced this. Luca was directing the convoy's dispersal with a precision that made Saren's chest tighten with something that was partly relief and partly a gratitude she didn't have time to examine. 3 days ago, Luca had been a soldier who couldn't make herself be a soldier. Now, she was coordinating an evacuation under threat with the calm efficiency of someone who had decided exactly how much of herself she was willing to spend, and was spending it deliberately. They had the convoy moving in 4 minutes. The Vethkara ship found the empty lot 11 minutes later. They went to ground in a collapsed rail tunnel 40 kilometers south. The Resistance had 3 secondary caches positioned along the route. Saren had not known about 2 of them, which was the point of caches. And by mid-morning, they were underground and still, and as dark as it got, which was dark enough. Luca sat beside Saren in the tunnel while they waited for the all-clear signal. Not talking at first, just the sounds of people breathing, of equipment being checked very quietly, of water dripping somewhere in the dark. The ship moved on, Luca said. Border Watch confirms. How many doses did you make total? Luca said, those 12. And I can synthesize more if I have the carrier stock. How long to synthesize a batch? 48 hours for a clean batch. Less if I cut corners on the toxicity checks, but I won't. Luca was quiet again. Then, there are 11 modified fighters in the Resistance network that I know of. There may be more. I know. 11 people who want to fight and can't. And if those 11 could fight again, I know, Saren said. That's why I made the 12 doses. Luca turned to look at her in the dark, and Saren could feel, rather than see the expression, something that had learned to be careful with hope and was being careful now. It's going to take time, Saren said. Synthesizing enough, reaching the other networks, administering safely, all of it takes time. And the Vethkara are going to know something is wrong. They're going to be looking. Let them look, Luca said. It was not a complicated thing, she said, and she didn't say it loudly. In the tunnel's dark, in the particular silence of people trying to be invisible, it landed like a stone dropped in still water, and Saren felt the ripples. She spent the next 3 weeks in transit, moving between Resistance cells with the padded case and the synthesizer and her paper notes. She administered doses to 8 more people. A former Marine named Okeki, who had been modified during a prisoner exchange and had since been sitting out the war in a Resistance safe house, doing logistics because it was what he could still bring himself to do, and who, after 47 minutes in an inverted storage room with Saren's formula in his system, had sat very still and then said, in a voice she would not forget, "So that's still in there." A pair of Resistance fighters, twins, unmodified but desperate, willing to volunteer as control subjects, whose scans she used to calibrate her monitoring against a clean baseline. A woman named Petra, a school teacher before the occupation, who had been one of the original 41,000 voluntary recipients, and who had lived for 11 years in the comfortable modified state and had, somewhere in those 11 years, become certain that something was missing, and who sobbed for 20 minutes after the formula worked, and then helped Saren pack up her equipment with the brisk efficiency of someone who had just remembered. They had a great deal to be angry about. Saren thought about Chandra constantly, not with grief now, or grief had become something else, something that moved forward rather than backward, the way rivers moved. She thought about his lectures. The one she remembered most clearly was not about neurobiology. It had been a digression. The kind Chandra did when something he'd been thinking about privately had pressed against the container of his lesson plan until it burst through. He'd been talking about the difference between adaptation and capitulation, about how the human brain was extraordinarily good at adapting to hostile environments, which was partly why humans had survived for this long, and partly why they were so vulnerable to certain kinds of gradual wrongness. The kind that came in slowly enough that each individual increment felt survivable. You adapt, you adjust, you find a way to function, and then, one day you look up and you are very far from where you meant to be, and the path back is not clear, and you have forgotten what it felt like to know the path at all. The modification was the most elegant version of this she'd ever seen. It was not torture. It was not imprisonment. It removed one specific thing, carefully, and the people it modified adapted, because humans always adapted, and then they lived in the adapted state and called it peace, because it was the only available word. Saren's formula was not simply restoration. She understood this better, now, having seen it work 8 more times. It was more like waking up, not from sleep, from a dream that had convinced you it was waking life, and the first minutes after were disorienting, and sometimes frightening, and then something cleared, and there was the person, looking out from behind their own eyes again. And what Saren felt watching it happen was not pride. Exactly, though it was adjacent to pride. It was more fundamental than that. It was the feeling of watching something be true. The Vethkara sent a delegation to what remained of the French Provisional Council in the 5th week. Saren was not there. She was 300 kilometers away in a tunnel, but she got the relay from Commander U in fragments, reconstructed later. The delegation was led by a senior administrator, a Vethkara official, whose designation translates loosely as something like overseer of neurological health, and who had brought what appeared to be an ultimatum, dressed in the language of concern. They had detected anomalous neurological signatures in several individuals. They were troubled by this, suggested that someone, somewhere, was attempting to interfere with the corrective modifications that had been administered for the good of the human population. They wanted this to stop. They wanted the responsible parties identified. They wanted the procedure, whatever it was, dismantled. They said this gently. They said it in the smooth, measured tones they had been using for 11 years, the tones of people who did not need to shout because everything was already arranged to their benefit. One of the Provisional Council members, a woman named Sato, who Saren had treated 2 weeks before and who had not told the council she'd been treated, listened to the delegation's statement and then asked quietly, what would happen if the individuals responsible chose not to cooperate? The Vethkara administrator paused. Then it said that the modifications could be re-administered. That they would be re-administered. This was not a preference, but a structural necessity. A population that had been brought to health could not be permitted to reintroduce the pathology that had been removed. Sato thanked the delegation for their time. The meeting ended. Sato sent Saren a coded message that night. It said, "They're afraid, I could tell. They were afraid of something small." Saren read this in the tunnel and felt the particular warmth of it. Not comfort exactly, but something that traveled in the same direction. She went back to the synthesizer. The thing about the Vethkara that the resistance had spent 11 years trying to understand, and that Saren now believed she finally did understand, was this. They had not come to Earth expecting a long campaign. They were methodical, technically superior in every way that mattered militarily, and accustomed to managing populations through the modification protocol with something very close to no resistance. Their history of managing other species was long and, from their perspective, clean. Identify the pathological architecture, remove it carefully, monitor for stability, maintain. The whole system presupposed a species that would, once modified, remain modified. Not through compliance or fear. They were sophisticated enough to know those were fragile, but through the removal of the very thing that would make a species resist. What they had not modeled was a neurobiologist who had kept her notes on paper. or a resistance network that had spent 11 years learning to move very carefully in the dark, or a formula that could, dose by dose, give back what had been taken. By the time the Vethkara administrator had returned to its ship from the Provisional Council meeting, there were 23 treated individuals in the resistance network. By the time the delegation's official report had been processed by whatever passed for a Vethkara bureaucracy, there were 31. The synthesizer ran on a 48-hour cycle, and Siren ran it every cycle. She had negotiated 3 additional people with chemistry backgrounds into learning the synthesis protocol, which she'd now written out in full on paper and distributed to 5 separate locations. If she was taken, the formula would not die with her. She thought about this often, in the way that you think about something that frightens you, specifically, because it is the right thing to plan for. She thought about Chandra, who had sent her the theoretical framework in the last communication he'd managed before the Vethkara found him, who had apparently trusted her to turn theory into chemistry, without being certain she could. She thought about that trust in the specific way she thought about things that both hurt and helped, the way you carry a heavy object that you are also glad to be carrying. She did not think about being taken without thinking almost immediately about something else. The convoy moving in the dark, Luca's voice giving directions, the tunnel full of people breathing quietly. The things that were in motion now that had not been in motion 6 weeks ago. 31 people who had been given back something the Vethkara had decided they couldn't be trusted with. She was afraid. She was always afraid. She'd found, since the formula worked on her, that the fear was sharper and more specific than it had been. And this was disorienting at first, and then clarifying in the way that sharp things often were. She knew exactly what she was afraid of. She knew exactly what she was working against. The fear had an address, and you could go there if you were careful, and you could do something about it. The Vethkara moved against the Resistance's main network in the 7th week. It was not the strike they were capable of. That was the thing Siren turned over and over in the aftermath, once she understood what had happened. The Vethkara had the capability to dismantle the Resistance's infrastructure comprehensively, and they had chosen something more surgical. Not a hunt, but a retrieval. They wanted the source of the neurological anomalies. They wanted whoever was producing the reversal. They wanted the formula. They got less than they were hoping for. What they got was the secondary lab in Reims, which Saren had evacuated 6 weeks ago, and which now contained nothing but empty equipment cases and one very pointed absence. And 3 resistance fighters who were captured during the sweep, but who were, as it happened, not among the treated, and could not therefore tell the Vethkara anything about the formula except that it existed and that someone had it. What they did not get was Siren, who was in a tunnel. What they did not get was the formula, which was in 5 separate locations on paper. What they did not get was Luca, or Okake, or Petra the schoolteacher, or the 17 other treated individuals who were now distributed across the Resistance's network in positions that were, by design, completely unremarkable. Not labeled, not concentrated. Just people who had been returned to themselves, doing what they could in a war that was going badly, and that was, possibly, not as decided as it had appeared. Commander Uche sent a brief message after the sweep concluded. It said, "They don't know how many we've treated. They don't know where the synthesis is happening. They think it's one person with one lab. And then, it's not one person anymore." Saren read this in the dark and felt the exact quality of that sentence. The shift in scale implied by the past tense. The plural that the sentence moved toward without stating it. It was not one person anymore. It was a network now. Slow and careful, and made of paper notes, and 48-hour synthesis cycles, and 31 people who had been restored to the full, complicated, dangerous, inconvenient fact of themselves. She thought about the Vethkara spurred, saying the modifications would be re-administered, the smooth certainty of it, the assumption that the removal was permanent, that the removed thing would not come back, that humanity would continue adapting to the smaller space they'd been given, the way humans adapted to everything. Quietly, with resilience, which the Vethkara had apparently read as docility, and which was, in fact, not the same thing at all. She picked up the synthesizer. She started the next batch. She did not know then how it would resolve. She did not think in terms of resolution. She thought in terms of the next 48 hours, and then the 48 hours after that. The formula, the synthesis. The careful movement through the network. Treated individuals returning to themselves one by one, the count rising. The Vethkara, watching their monitoring systems and seeing the anomalies multiply, and this was what she believed, and what Sato had told her the delegation's body language confirmed. Not understanding how. Not understanding that the thing they'd removed was not as removable as they'd thought, because they had not accounted for a particular human tendency. The one where you build the antidote while you're still suffering the poison, where you refuse to let the loss be total, where you keep notes on paper in your coat, and you stay in motion, and you do not stop. The formula worked. That was the factual center of it, as Chandras would have said. The formula worked, and everything else was implementation. She measured the carrier solution. She added the primary complex. She started the timer. In the tunnel somewhere behind her, she heard Luca's voice. Quiet, giving someone directions. In the relay unit on the bench, a status light blinked. 34 treated individuals now, after the morning's work. The synthesizer made its low, sustained hum. The sound she'd been hearing for weeks. The sound she associated, now, with something she had no precise word for. Something in the range of determined. Something in the range of alive. She leaned over the bench and checked the temperature. Correct. She checked the binding assay. Correct. She straightened up and rolled the tension out of her shoulders, and thought about what Chandra had said. Once, when she'd asked him why he'd gone into neurobiology specifically, out of all the sciences he could have chosen, he'd said, because the brain is where the self lives. And the self is the most interesting thing there is. Capacity to know you exist. The capacity to choose. Capacity to decide that something is wrong and do something about it. That's all in there. In 3 pounds of wet tissue. I want to understand it. I want to protect it. She checked the timer. 31 hours remaining on the batch. She sat down on the floor, with her back against the bench, her coat around her, and let herself be tired for a few minutes. Through the tunnel wall, she could hear the muffled sounds of the resistance going about its business in the dark. Low voices. The click of equipment. The specific rhythm of people who had decided not to stop. She thought about Chandra. She thought about the 41,000 volunteers who had asked to be made calmer and had not known what else they were giving up. She thought about Mira Luca saying, I forgot that anger could have a direction. She thought about all of it as the synthesizer hummed, and the timer ran, and the batch came together. Molecule by molecule, in the cold. The Vethkara had called it a mercy when they took the first volunteers. She thought about what you called it when you took it back. She didn't have a clean word for it. That was fine. She had 31 people who were themselves again, and 32 coming, and a formula on paper in 5 locations, and 48 hours to the next batch, and Luca's voice in the dark giving directions. It would do.